So today, I'm honored to be here at ProductCamp. Thank you everyone for sponsoring this presentation and having me here. So the title is 9 Temptations of Product Owners, or how you can easily cause failure in your project if you're a product owner. I'm going to talk about some shortcuts that are really not very good for you to take. As I'm an enterprise agile coach for NetSpend Corporation. Whoops, it says PayPal. I was at PayPal for 11 years, but now I'm an enterprise agile coach for NetSpend. And we'll go on. So temptation is sort of a desire to engage in a short-term activity that isn't quite the right thing for the longer term. So you can threaten your longer term goals and you can have problems down the road if you take shortcuts, as this little graphic illustrates. So I'm going to launch into this. This is originally an hour presentation, so I'm going to have to go pretty quickly. But the first temptation that I like to talk about is that there's no real need to bother with creating a business strategy before developing a backlog. So the question that I'm going to ask you to answer real quickly here is, what value is there in developing a business strategy? So I'm going to flip back off of that. And would somebody like to just let me know what value there is in developing a business strategy before you start developing a backlog?
Well, it just kind of helps you prioritize what's important and what's not important.
That's true. There's a priority aspect to it. It helps you prioritize. Who else has an answer to this?
It helps you focus on what is important.
That's correct. It helps you focus on what's important. It gives you the vision of where you are going. And that's critical, and it's critical because all of the people that are involved in the project need to be able to make independent decisions without running to you as a product owner every time they have a question. Now, of course, they'll go to you on the big questions, but they make dozens and dozens of small decisions every day, and they need to understand that business strategy in order to effectively make those decisions. So, for example, business strategy is very essential to develop a robust architecture. If you don't understand your business strategy, then the architecture isn't going to be solid underneath, and you'll end up doing some rework on your architecture, nor will you be able to build an emergent architecture framework where architecture emerges as you learn throughout the course of the development work. To the point of emergent learning, strategic analysis, that trying to understand what that strategy is helps you learn and understand your market. It helps you define a high-level strategy that will help you instill confidence in what you're doing. If you don't have it, then you're going to be rudderless. There's going to be a lot of organizational churn. And as I already mentioned, it helps developers make independent decisions. So the first shortcut is not putting together a business strategy before you create your backlog. So the next one is, I know what the market values. I don't have to talk to customers before building a backlog. So very quickly, what value is there in developing business strategy before creating the backlog? I mean,
you're learning more about your customers and where that value is going to come back.
Right. I'm sorry. I've asked the wrong question. It's what can you learn from working with customers that you can't learn any other way?
Their major pain points.
Their major pain points. That's one thing. What is it that hurts? What else can you learn from customers you can't learn any other way?
Your own blind spots about the market. Maybe you have assumptions that don't hold true after doing customer interviews.
Right. Blind spots in the market. There's another really important thing you can learn from customers. What else?
Their terminology and language.
Terminology and language. Right. Yeah, you want to be able to speak to customers in their domain language. You want to be able to communicate effectively with them. What else? You still haven't hit the big one that I'm thinking about. How about how much they'll pay? That's pretty critical to a business. So the fundamental problems they face, we talked about that. How much they're willing to pay, that's a critical thing. I mean, we can't run a business if we provide a great solution that no one will pay for. Also, whether they find your solution workable or usable, whether it solves their specific problem, and specifically what customer segment you should target, because oftentimes when you're developing a product and you work with your customers, you find out that you don't have quite the right product, but you can pivot easily or maybe with a little difficulty, into a peripheral area and develop a better product that more effectively serves your customer. So the second shortcut is not talking to customers. And there's all kinds of reasons why people give that they don't want to do that. It's too far. I've got too many different customers and different kinds of customers. They're too far away. All kinds of reasons, but work with your customers. Go through the discovery process. The next shortcut is, it isn't really necessary for me to understand the life cycle of a story on the backlog. Now, let me talk about what the life cycle of a story is so you'll understand that. Stories or epics begin with a statement of need. So as a product owner, the first thing that happens to you is you determine that there's a problem. And that problem is a customer pain point that has to be addressed. That is a long, long, long way away from a very specific implementation of a solution with buttons on a screen and the layout of the screen and the business logic that underlies it and the architecture of the system and the connections to persistent databases and networks and whatnot. So from a problem statement to the actual solution is a long gap. And that's what I mean by the life cycle of a story, because as you go from that problem statement all the way to that very specific solution, that's a process of emergent learning. And the story is basically, or the epic is a series of refinement steps. And if you don't understand what those refinement steps are, how they're ordered, and how the hierarchical decomposition works, you're not going to be a very effective product owner, right? And so let me, I think I got a little ahead of myself. How does the story life cycle impact the quality of your backlog? So I've given you a part of it, but there's more to it than that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Defining the dependent areas of the product.
I'm sorry, can you say again? I just didn't hear you.
Just understanding the full story life cycle will help you find areas of dependencies.
That's true. That's true. And one of the reasons why that is because your the group of stakeholders you interact with changes as you go through the life cycle. Because at first you're primarily working with customers, primarily. At the end, you're primarily working with developers, right? So the stakeholder group that you interact with changes. So let me go on. This is 3 and we're a third of the way through the presentation, so I need to keep going. So refinement creates opportunities for emergent learning and creativity. You know, the working stakeholder groups change as stories are refined. You go from working primarily with customers to largely with developers, not leaving customers out though. Stories evolve from being a statement of need to a very specific solution. Acceptance criteria becomes more and more specific. So at the highest level of story creation, acceptance criteria is very vague, like we need to notify a customer that a transaction occurred. But as you refine the story, the acceptance criteria gets very, very granular. Like we need to send an email or we need to send a text document, a text. So the acceptance criteria goes from more generic to more specific. And non-essential refined stories can be prioritized lower than essential ones. So if you understand that life cycle and the prioritization is there, then you can do that. So then item 3, you got to understand how the story life cycle works to be a good product owner and develop your product well. Next, everything has to be done, so backlog prioritization is a waste of time. I'm not even going to say a word about this. What development consequences result from an unprioritized backlog?
Do we have time to discuss my entire last job? It's bad. I will leave it at that.
Yeah, but why? Come on, why?
Because if you don't have a sense of what needs to be done at what time, you have no way to manage your resources effectively, which means that your budget's thrown off, your timeline's thrown off, and if any of your dependencies rely on things getting done at a certain time, which there always are, if you do thing Z before you do thing A, there's your whole project and your whole product shot.
Yep. Very
If
good.
everything's a priority, nothing is the phrase I always come up with.
Right. And if there's no good priority, then you can't understand how to deliver the most valuable thing first. So you guys are right on the mark here. I mean, this is basically you giving this presentation. So less value is delivered. Confusion about what to work on. Developers, not the business side, important. If you're, as a product owner, aren't deciding and prioritizing, guess who's doing it? The developers. They're making that decision. Is that what you really want? No. Product delivery is delayed. Resource conflicts, people, equipment, environments. Release bloats up to larger sizes because you're doing stuff that's unnecessary. And it discourages emergent learning. And emergent learning is one of the most important things. You'll hear me harp on this over and over again. It's important over and over and over again. Did I lose my screen here? Can you still see my screen? Am I presenting still?
You're fine.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. All right. I think I have a problem here. Just one second. Okay. Hang on. Okay, so it's okay to have more than one person accountable for your backlog. So question is, why is that the case? So we're on shortcut number 5. Why is it okay? Is it not okay to have more than one person accountable for your backlog?
The product owner should be accountable for the backlog if you're doing agile.
Yeah, but what if you have more than one product owner? Have you ever seen a team that has more than one product owner? I have. I've seen teams that have had 2 or 3 or 4 different people feeding in requirements to the team.
So different ideas around prioritization?
That's certainly a good one. Yeah.
Communication and collaboration gets screwed up because people can talk to more than one person and they may not be talking to each other.
Yeah. And when the developer has a problem, who does he go to? How does he know which one is the right person to talk to? Or how does she know whether the thing that she's working on is the most important thing, because there's not even agreement between the sources that are feeding the backlog. Yeah, so it's pretty bad. And I've seen some real bad situations in my career as an enterprise agile coach.
Scott, aren't the rules of Agile really clear about only one product owner, or do people just ignore it that blatantly?
They are pretty clear, and people do ignore it blatantly, but even people with good intentions have issues. For example, they might have a product owner that isn't directly in contact with the customer, and there's some intermediary between the product owner and the customer. And that intermediary is not only going through the product owner, but also going around the product owner to the team. Or you might have a product owner that's feeding in business requirements, and you might have a technical counsel that's feeding in architectural requirements. So there's a number of different ways that this can happen. Okay, so I think we're on like 6 now. It's just extra work to refine 2 sprints of backlog stories for planning. I'm just not going to bother. So the question is, how does having 2 sprints of stories foster development productivity? So why is it good to have 2 sprints of backlog stories for planning?
Prioritization pivots.
Prioritization, can you explain just a little bit more what that means?
Yeah, sure. So if you have 2 backlogs, right, or enough tickets that are worth a couple of sprints, you're able to then just pivot with different priorities. So as things change, as things iterate, you can then appropriately change with priorities instead of, kind of be all hands on deck, chicken with your head cut off type all the time.
Okay, that's good. Who else? Why is it good to have 2 sprints of backlog stories for planning? Come on. You've got 20-something people. Somebody has an idea here.
I think it depends upon if your team finishes their work earlier, then you can always assign them, stories that are ready to work on, so your productivity doesn't dip and your velocity doesn't dip.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Anybody else got another one real quick?
Yeah, the reverse is true too. You can dig into things and find out they're much more difficult or expensive than they are worthwhile. And so knowing what you can pull in when something has to get shoved is useful.
Yeah, yeah. So there's another, so those are all good. There's another big one. I'll just go through these. Planning meetings aren't sidelined by hasty story creation to fill gaps. So if you don't have 2 sprints worth of stories, then you might have a story in your first sprint that's ill-conceived and needs to be reworked, which would delay your planning meeting. They don't end prematurely because you don't have enough content, and that might cause a different meeting. You have more flexibility to optimally organize the team's work. So this one is really key. So let's say we're in a sprint and the team is planning a sprint, but one of our guys is sick and out for a week. You might want to pull in a story that person was optimally placed to work on and push that story to the next sprint and bring in one that's slightly, that was planned for 2 weeks out, just to optimize the effectiveness of the team. Also, the product quality will improve if you have more clarity in terms of near-term work. So if you have a horizon of 2 sprints, you have a better idea of what's coming up and how to work on the stuff that you're currently working on. And then it can certainly lead to more predictability because you have the flexibility to move stories in and out of that sprint. Next one. No need for a definition of ready for my story. The developers know what I want. So you're a product owner and you're handing a story off to the developers to have it developed, and the team doesn't have a definition of ready. What's the problem with that? Why should developers and product owners collaborate and agree on a definition of ready? Whoops.
To establish clear goals and outcomes.
Very good. Yes, to establish clear goals and outcomes. And what does that help how does that help the team? One thing is it helps the testers know exactly what they have to do to meet the requirement in the story. So they can design their tests more effectively. Be clear about story quality needed to begin development to enable accurate sizing of stories. If you don't have that, then the stories are not going to be effectively sized. And it's absolutely essential to effectively begin sprint planning sessions. And it can help the team identify dependencies, and it can reduce requests for more information after the sprint development begins. So by all means, if your teams don't, and the product owner and the team don't have a definition of ready, please go put one together and make it clear. And I assure you it will limit finger pointing at the end of the sprint. Next one, I have stories on my backlog that are more than a year away. So what? So what are the disadvantages of having stories that are way out there, so far away that they're not coming down the pipe for 9 months to a year? What are the disadvantages of that?
Well, priorities might change, or the requirements of that ticket or those stories might change.
Yes, that's the most important reason. It's because things change very dramatically in our industry, and it's very likely that you won't ever do that. And so what is the waste involved in this? You've already spent time working on putting something together that may not even be implemented, right? You have any ideas about other things that might be a problem if you have stories on your backlog that are far away?
Well, company strategy could also change, when if you're looking at something that isn't part of the strategic plan anymore, then, it's also kind of like I wouldn't say a wasted effort, but certainly you're not in sync with what's the larger company vision is.
That's true. That's true. But if you don't implement it, it is waste by definition. So how does it cost you to have those kind of stories? Well, for one thing, it's going to cost you storage space, some complexity, and content tracking systems. So you'll have a JIRA backlog that is just tremendous, and you have to wade through all of that stuff every time you want to work on the backlog. And of course, time is wasted in managing and prioritizing and writing all of those things in the first place. And so there's an argument that people make that, oh, well, we might use it in the future, so it's worth putting down now. But that argument is really easily countered by saying, if it's important in the future, it's going to come up again. And when it comes up again, we'll know more about this than we know now. And so my recommendation to you is don't bother with it if it looks like it's not going to be done for quite a long time. Just leave it off. And then at the time you make a decision to implement it, you'll have a lot more knowledge and be able to do a lot better job of constructing that story.
Well, Scott, but this kind of goes against my thinking. There's still some value to writing that stuff down somewhere to share it with your management and stuff. Maybe it should not be in the backlog, but maybe you have to have a different list.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't record the story somewhere. You just shouldn't spend a lot of time on it. It shouldn't be anything more than a placeholder. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to capture that kind of stuff for the future. You really do, somewhere, because you need to foster discussion on it. You need to figure out whether it's valuable or not. All right. I think this is the final shortcut. My backlog stories are unsized or very large, no problem. So why is it a good idea to size your stories? Even, why is it a good idea to size your stories?
If they're too big, they'll carry over.
That's a really good point. So you want to size them so that you don't push stories from one sprint to the next. There's a lot of reasons here besides that one. What else?
It limits
Represent
your ability
potential.
to prioritize.
I'm sorry, say again.
They represent potential future commitments, and so if they're unknown or unbounded in size, they can't be prioritized. I mean, like everything has a cost, and if you don't know the cost, then it's not prioritizable.
That's a really great point. Yeah, there's a cost associated with them that you can't assess if you don't know the size. Anything else? So the main point that I have here is that stories that are unsized have a lot of risk associated with them, right? The size actually, to me, is not as important as the process of sizing itself. Eisenhower famously said that the developing plans for war, the plans that result weren't very valuable, but the process of developing the plans was indispensable. And that's the situation we have here. It's the process of sizing that caused people to look into what are the risks, what are the dependencies, what are the tools we have to use? Do we have the technology to develop this? Who might do that? All of those things enter into the sizing question, and all of those are critically important for developing a size. So, you know, when teams talk to me about, well, we don't want a size or don't need a size, you know, if they really don't want to do it, I say just go through the sizing exercise and throw away the size after you finish it, because the important part of this is going through analysis to develop the size. So risk and dependencies are identified during the sizing process. It creates opportunities to learn what to build and how to build it. Planning sessions don't bog down into just endless analysis, and delivery expectations are correctly set. And I missed the point about cost. I'm going to go back and add that bullet point. So thank you for that addition. Now I'm very close to being at time. I have to continue here.
Yeah, you do have a question as well.
And before I just move on, well, let me take that question. What is the question?
So Hallie is asking that
I think
where are you storing? I'm sorry?
I think we already we touched on that, kind of where do you store those far future stories that you know you've got to get to. We can keep rolling. It's all good.
Okay. So real quickly, before we adjourn here, does anybody have any something else that as a product owner tempts you that I haven't touched on? Because there are a lot of temptations to cut corners with pressure on product owners to get things out of the door. So what other things tempt you that can ultimately be bad for your project?
I have one that's less about cutting corners. I think this applies to all, starts with a P, management roles. It's doing things that go beyond your job description. There's a great quote from Parks and Rec where a character says, don't half-ass a bunch of things, whole-ass one thing. And I know that in my previous project management roles, I've been asked to be a product owner, a project manager, an account manager, and a product manager kind of all in one. And that just leads to inefficiency and being spread too thin to do good work. So that's a big one, is wearing too many hats.
Yeah, and I've seen that in product owners that are supporting too many teams as well. So, you know, the best I've ever seen a product owner ever really be able to do is support 2 teams. And as soon as the product owners assign 3 teams, quality starts dramatically decreasing. So, I mean, arguably, at least in my perspective, arguably the product owner job is the hardest job on the team. Certainly, it requires the most breadth of knowledge. Developers can specialize in one area, like front end or back end or networks or databases or whatever. But product owners have to be able to talk to customers effectively, and then they also have to be able to talk to developers effectively. And those are 2 entirely different languages. And product owners have to bridge that gap, and doing that for more than 2 teams is just next to impossible effectively. Well, let me thank everybody for coming. I hope you found value in this session. I've really enjoyed giving it, and thank you for your participation and your great observations. These presentations kind of carry themselves because of all the participation and the great ideas, and I certainly learn as much from you guys as you might have learned from me. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.